Ladies and gentlemen, I was most touched to have been asked to contribute to your conference, and I'm only so sorry that I cannot be with you in person, but instead appearing in this rather disembodied, yet I hope suitably low-carbon form. Now, if I may say so, your focus on the management of arid lands could not be more important. Every year, land degradation adds some 12 million hectares to the quarter of the world's land that is already desert, and that rate is steadily increasing. You will all know very well that at the heart of the problem is long-term damage to the particularly fragile soils of arid and semi-arid lands. Removing the sparse tree cover and allowing overgrazing makes the soil much more vulnerable to erosion, which in turn jeopardizes already marginal livelihoods. Superimposed upon these local impacts are the consequences of climate change and the extent to which the rising average global temperature is linked with altered rainfall patterns. In some parts of the world, such as East Africa, this is another factor contributing to the transformation of savanna to desert. The fact that 1/3 of the world's land is now at some risk from the effects of desertification presents an alarming challenge to humanity. Yet, identifying how best to address and reverse the cascade of causes and effects that is engendering these problems still seems to be largely neglected on the international agenda. It is quite clearly a subject that warrants urgent attention, which is why I am so pleased that your gathering is taking place today. I am also encouraged, if I may say so, by your focus on what we can learn from the traditional societies which manage the soil, water and vegetation of dry lands for millennia without causing their destruction. Modern science certainly has a vital part to play, not least, for example, in the use of remote sensing by satellites to map the scale of the problem. But when looking at what will work on the ground, the store of traditional knowledge is hugely important, offering hard-earned insights that we ignore at our peril. Some arid and semi-arid lands have sustained farming throughout history, whereas in others the ecosystem has collapsed, precipitating the end of food production. I believe that we can learn a great deal from those communities still using traditional methods of land management to ensure that in future we achieve more sustainability and less degradation. Above all, it seems to me that they have a deep understanding that nature's limits are not shortcomings that need to be fixed, but guidelines that we need to understand and under which we need to operate, recognizing that they place limitations on our ambitions and the ways in which we pursue them. Human populations are still rising in a thoroughly unsustainable way in many of the countries with arid and semi-arid climates. So it is becoming ever more important that sustainable land management practices are identified and spread as widely and as quickly as possible. This is not only to protect the systems that presently sustain livelihoods and food security, but also to build resilience against what are now the inevitable and already tangible impacts of climate change. Ladies and gentlemen, in this connection, I very much hope that you will not overlook the potential of integrated livestock systems, both in relation to their capacity to restore soil fertility and at the same time act as a carbon sink, thereby supporting the French government's 4 per 1,000 initiative announced at last year's COP21 Paris meeting. For what it is worth, I have a strong feeling that holistic livestock grazing management systems, as advocated by Alan Savory and others, have a potentially central role to play, not only in restoring the fertility of degraded soils, but also sequestering soil carbon in the form of stable organic matter. Many indigenous farming groups understood these approaches intuitively, but as we know, overstocking can increase grazing pressure to the point where livestock become part of the problem instead of the solution, leaving soils vulnerable to erosion. Another approach which has captured my attention is the potential of composting systems to create fertile soils using recycled organic material, thus avoiding the need for expensive chemical fertilizers. I can't help feeling that the world needs a composting revolution, especially in relation to restoring degraded soils on arid lands, as has been wonderfully demonstrated in Egypt by Helmi Abuleish at Sekhem. A further strategy that must surely be at the heart of the response to the challenges we face is large-scale woodland restoration. And in this regard, I was much encouraged to hear about the launch of the African Forest Landscape Restoration Initiative that has set out to restore 100 million hectares of degraded land across the continent by 2030. This may seem hugely ambitious, but it is absolutely vital if we are serious about food security, livelihoods, conservation, and the rest of the aims set out in the Sustainable Development Goals that were adopted by the United Nations last year. My International Sustainability Unit has begun work on a program of activities to facilitate discussion on how best to encourage forest restoration at landscape scale. And I do so hope that their efforts will assist this and other similarly minded initiatives. Your meeting is, of course, taking place in a highly appropriate location for the subject matter. The dry lands of the southwestern United States that today, like countless others around the world, are so widely degraded, once supported farming systems that had continued uninterrupted for thousands of years. It was methods imported from Europe, no doubt with the best of intentions, that led to forest loss and soil damage, the consequences of which are seen today in erosion, flooding, water scarcity, and other malign consequences. Halting and reversing land degradation in our dryland communities, in the face of a changing climate and while feeding a vastly growing population, is an immense and frightening challenge.